So my presentation today is going to be focused on two major crop pests, Helicoverpa armigera and fall armyworm. Now I'm sure people will be very familiar already with Helicoverpa armigera and the challenges that come with managing that particular pest. And I guess people are also getting used to the idea of fall armyworm being part of the landscape as well, with it having seasonal presence in New South Wales over the last couple of years or so. And of course, a major challenge in managing these particular pests is due to their strong capacity to develop resistance to insecticides. And so I wanted to use the opportunity today to share some of the findings from the work that DPI has been doing in resistance surveillance, which is primarily focused on making sure that we have a system in place to measure change in resistance in these pests over time. Because it's going to be important to have a practical way of alerting people to the presence of resistance in those populations so that can give us time then to adopt mitigation tactics before we get to the point where we actually start to see field failures occurring. So I just wanted to start off with a bit of a rundown of some of the key differences between the two species. So in terms of the insect adult stage, the moths of fall armyworm are very strong flyers and they can move very long distances on prevailing weather systems. And although the permanent range of fall armyworm is within Australia's northern tropics, that strong migratory capacity means that populations that build up in those source areas can easily disperse and establish pretty much anywhere where there are suitable host crops. Now, of course, it's the larval life stage that causes crop damage. And although fall armyworm has been reported on a wide range of host plants, the majority of damage occurs in maize and sweet corn, with some damage also likely to occur in sorghum. Now, the presence of young larvae in vegetative crops becomes pretty obvious because they cause a windowing effect on leaves, and they can also enter the whorl, which results in shot holes. And as the leaf unfurls, the extent of that damage in the whorl will become a lot more visible. And of course, as the plants develop, larvae then cause significant damage to the reproductive structures of mature plants, so corn ears and sorghum heads. Armigera moths, on the other hand, are generated locally in cropping areas, and they tend to cycle out of one crop and into another, and they will hang around in those areas just so long as there are suitable host plants available to establish on. And although armigera moths don't have the same migratory capacity as fall armyworm, they can still get pushed around on weather fronts and so can disperse between regions. Armigera also has a winter diapause, so in other words, it can remain dormant in the soil through winter and then re-establish in crops during spring. Whereas fall armyworm can't tolerate those kinds of cold temperatures and they will die out in winter, particularly in inland regions which experience regular frosts. Armigera also has a very wide host range and it will establish in all field crops, with pulses, maize and sorghum being particularly at risk from damage. Larvae of fall armyworm will feed on the leaves of crops, but they are most damaging on the growing terminals and the reproductive structures of plants, such as buds, flowers and pods. And because of that feeding behaviour, armigera and fall armyworm larvae can become concealed in those feeding sites, which can then reduce their exposure to insecticide sprays. So in-crop monitoring is a really important first action in management of these pests. But larvae can be a bit tricky to tell apart, especially when they're small. So if you need help with identification, DPI does provide a free larval ID service. And all you have to do is send images to the email address fallarmyworm@DPI, and we can help you out with those inquiries. Now, of course, in a wet year like we've just had, there is a strong possibility that there may be larvae of other species around in crops, so things like other spodopteran species or native armyworms, for example. And so it's important to correctly identify the pest and also to use the correct thresholds to help maximise the cost effectiveness of your spray applications. So we know both species have a strong capacity to develop resistance to insecticides. and that those genes for resistance can be spread easily in the landscape by migration and dispersal, both within and between regions. Now, there is likely to be strong selection pressure for resistance in maize and sorghum, just because this is where, both species are likely to occur together. And also because the same insecticides are registered on both species in those crops. And I guess the other consideration is, with the recent wet conditions that we've seen across, much of eastern Australia, we'd expect that to drive host abundance, including both crop and non-crop hosts, things like weeds and pasture species, for example, and that's going to drive pest pressure up. And so that means more spraying and higher selection for resistance as a result. So we know that host abundance is a key driver of population build-up in Armigera, but for fall armyworm, I guess we are still in a bit of a learning phase, and we don't yet have a full picture of how seasonal variability is going to drive those populations. But I guess it's reasonable to expect that pest pressure in temperate cropping regions of Australia is going to be influenced by how favourable the season is, and also by population build-up in those source areas of northern Australia. And I guess it's also going to depend on the weather systems that create that annual southerly dispersal of moths away from those source areas. And this all adds up to there being a likelihood of, a very high degree of variability in areas outside of northern Australia. And you'll see the kind of seasonal fall armyworm variability that we've had already in New South Wales in these graphs here, which just show the trap catch data from 2020-21, which is the broken line on those graphs, and last year's trapping data, which is the coloured area under the line. So data from the North Coast, which you can see on the top graph there, shows a single major peak of greater than 400 moths, and that occurred during the winter of 2021. But last year there were regular peaks of between 400 and 500 moths, except in March and April when sampling was really heavily impacted by floods. So we can say that there seems to be a resident population on the North Coast, and this was also the only region where populations persisted over winter. So if you compare that with what's going on in the Northwest, this is where we saw a strong peak in October of 2020, which coincided with early maize plantings, and then there were low weekly counts for the rest of that season. Whereas last year, what we saw was a slow build up through spring to a much later peak in mid to late summer. And the magnitude of those peaks was considerably lower than what we'd seen in the North Coast region. Now, in central and southern parts of the state, the Riverina was the area that had the highest moth activity, and there was a single peak there in late summer at similar moth levels to what we'd seen in the northwest. And in 2022 in the southeast, there was a very strong peak of activity during late summer and into autumn, and the magnitude of that moth activity actually exceeded what we'd previously seen on the north coast. But look, after only 2 years, it's a bit hard to know, what a typical season is going to look like for fall armyworm. And a lot more research is needed to understand what the drivers of those populations are. But the seasonal patterns in temperate regions, like New South Wales, are potentially the most interesting because the factors that drive populations in those areas are likely to be less predictable than in Northern Australia. And so this is where the modelling work by CSER and others, could be really useful for forecasting seasonal variability of fall armyworm, which could then be really beneficial for managing seasonal risk in those more temperate growing regions. So I guess it's safe to assume that at some point, fall armyworm is probably going to appear in crops. So it is best to be on the front foot by doing regular in-crop monitoring for the presence of larvae, and also to be on the lookout for any signs of crop damage. And if populations are above threshold and sprays are warranted, then it's best to use timely applications of insecticides, before larvae get the chance to bury themselves in whorls and ears of plants, at which point, chemical control is going to be a whole lot more difficult to achieve. But it is very important to realise that just because a product might be registered, that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually going to provide effective control of these pests. And we already have a pretty good understanding of the practical implications of resistance in armigera, particularly when it comes to broad-spectrum insecticides like SPs, which we know to be pretty ineffective on armigera. And it's also important to realise that fall armyworm had already been exposed to selection pressure from broad-spectrum insecticides on a global scale over many decades before it arrived in Australia. So unsurprisingly, this was always going to impact how effective some of those products were likely to be on Australian fall armyworm populations. So one of the first questions that we wanted to address early on was to find out what the pre-existing levels of resistance were in Australian fall armyworm, and then to determine a baseline or a reference point so that we had the capacity to measure any changes in resistance that might occur over time. So DPI did a study to benchmark insecticide toxicity by looking at the comparative efficacy of insecticides in both fall armyworm and armigera. So in other words, we wanted to find out whether insecticides performed as well in the two species, or whether they performed better or worse in one species compared to another. So the benchmarking part of this study started off by looking at the data from our annual resistance surveillance program in armigera, and we know from that program that resistance to group 5, 6 and 28 are currently low in the armigera population. And groups 5 and 28 also have an overall rating of low for their impacts on non-target invertebrates. So these are highly compatible with integrated pest management. Now, imamectin is rated as moderate in terms of its impact on non-targets because it does have some impact on predatory bugs and bees. So indoxacarb is also rated as low for non-targets, but there have been elevated levels of resistance detected to indoxacarb, particularly in central and northern Queensland, where levels peaked in 2019. But those levels have dropped off from about 2020 onwards, presumably as a result of low host availability during the drought, which obviously meant less spraying and less selection for insecticide resistance. But we have seen resistance emerge in other regions since, such as the Darling Downs last year and the Macquarie Valley the year before that. But the overall average is really what we look at in terms of quantitative shifts in industry-wide frequency, and it does seem to be pretty stable at the moment for indoxacarb. Now, carbamates, on the other hand, have high impacts on non-target invertebrates, and there are also moderate to high levels of resistance to carbamates. So there is a high likelihood that the use of these products will result in unsatisfactory outcomes for management of armigera. And of course, it's also going to undermine IPM. Similarly, for synthetic pyrethroids, these have very high non-target impacts, and there are also extremely high levels of resistance to SPs in armigera, which means there is a very high likelihood of spray failures. And again, use of these products will be highly disruptive to beneficial invertebrate populations and therefore not compatible with IPM. So then we look to see how the resistance profile in armigera compared with that of fall armyworm. So for groups 5, 6 and 28 insecticides, we actually saw very similar levels of toxicity in fall armyworm and armigera. So both species have very high levels of susceptibility, so no evidence of resistance emerging to any of those insecticidal groups at this stage. Now, indoxacarb, on the other hand, is significantly less toxic on fall armyworm compared with armigera. And it's not really clear why there is this higher level of insensitivity in fall armyworm, and it may just be an inherent level of intolerance rather than it being the result of selection pressure from indoxacarb. And as you might expect, we found high levels of resistance to carbamates and SPs in fall armyworm, very similar to what we see in armigera. So then what does all this mean in terms of ongoing resistance risk for armigera and fall armyworm? So at the moment in the grains industry at least, the resistance risk for group 5 and 6 is probably still low to moderate because resistance levels are low and also product usage is pretty low. But usage in other farming systems like horticulture could cause that risk to increase for both species over time. So it's a bit of a watch and act at the moment. So for group 28s, on the other hand, these have broad registration and they're used extensively for control of LEP species in both summer and winter cropping. And so it gets used extensively also in horticulture. So there is a high risk of resistance developing to that group in both species. For indoxacarb, there is a very high risk of further increases in resistance, firstly because of the lower levels of susceptibility in armigera and fall armyworm populations, and secondly because resistance is controlled by dominant genes. So there is a very high level of heritability, which means that frequencies can increase quickly under high selection pressure. And as far as the broad spectrums are concerned, we are to the point where we're beyond being able to manage resistance to those groups. So it's going to be important to make sure that insecticides which are currently effective for both armigera and fall armyworm do continue to stay that way. And so it's going to be important to continually monitor the situation, to look for resistance that might emerge as the result of insecticide use in Australia, but which also might arrive here as the result of exotic resistance incursions from near neighbours, where insecticide use might not be as tightly regulated as what it is here. So what we really need is proactive and cross-industry approaches to management, including effective methods for detecting resistance genes that evolve at the field level. So to do that, what we do is we use a thing called an F2 screen, which is where we test the grandchildren of field-collected insects to recover rare resistance genes in the F2 recombinants. Now, this technique is extremely sensitive for detecting resistance, and it really gives us that early warning of emerging resistance issues, which is so critical because the sooner you can become aware of resistance in field populations, the better your chances of being able to effectively manage it. So we've designed this system of testing so it can be used for both armigera and fall armyworm, and there is an added benefit here of being able to create a lot of efficiency in resistance surveillance if we're doing it for both species. So this system has been used to keep track of resistance frequencies in armigera for about the last 8 years or so. And we've really focused our attention on those high-risk areas of central and northern Queensland because, well, this is where insect pressure and insecticide use is pretty high. And so just to demonstrate that point, whereas our population surveillance data in New South Wales shows that fall armyworm trap catches can, be in the hundreds, in some areas of Queensland, trap catches can actually be in the thousands. So there is potentially a whole lot more selection pressure being applied to those populations in those regions, and any resistance genes that might emerge can then potentially spread to other cropping zones. So that's why surveillance in those regions has been a key priority, and investment to support that work has come from a number of different projects. So we've just finished a 3-year project supported by the grains industry to do Helicoverpa resistance surveillance in central and northern Queensland. And we've also just completed a 3-year project doing Helicoverpa surveillance in rotational crops of cotton. And in fact, we've just started a new CRDC project to continue that surveillance work. And we're also collaborating with QDAF in a project to monitor fall armyworm resistance in the northern region. And this project takes a broader cross-industry approach to surveillance because we're testing samples from both the grains and the horticultural systems up there. So we're anticipating that the outcomes from these projects are going to help to inform future management of both fall armyworm and armigera. So that's all I have for today, but look, please do get in touch if you require any further information on our resistance surveillance program. And thank you for listening.